Hey, Jerry, we still can't see your screen yet.
How about now, Neil? Neil, can you see the screen now?
No, Jerry. Try it again. It's new share.
Sorry, Neil, where can I find that new share? I keep getting a message that I can't.
Yeah, Jerry, just go to share your screen, and you should be able to share your screen from there.
Sorry, Neil, I keep getting, I cannot share the screen while other participant is sharing.
Try it now, Jerry.
Can you see it now, Neil?
Yep. Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties. Jerry, you have control.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Again, we apologize for technical difficulties. Neil and I are 300 miles apart, so we're getting this worked out. We're really excited that you are able to join us here today. We have quite a few people on the webinar today, and we're excited to talk about the accreditation program at IACLEA. What we will do today is run through some topics here. You'll see them, accreditation overview for those who can't see the screen. We'll talk about the key players involved in accreditation. We'll discuss the standards, and then we'll move on quickly to agency policies and procedures. We'll talk about what a standard file, the standards files actually look like, and question and answer. And really what we want the webinar to be about today is primarily about the question and answer. So I have a short PowerPoint slide here that I will run through, and then we will open it up to your questions and bring in the other presenters to answer those and to have a good discussion about what accreditation means and how to achieve it. As Neil said, we have three presenters. We have Jessica Ludke, who's the Assistant Director of Public Safety and the Accreditation Manager at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and Jessica's also the Chair of the IACLEA Accreditation Commission. Jim Nowojcik is Director of Campus Safety and Security at St. Thomas Aquinas College. He is also an IACLEA Accreditation Commissioner. And then finally, we have Tamara McCullough, who's the Accreditation Manager and Clery Compliance Manager at Indiana State University Police Department. And Tamara is also an IACLEA Accreditation Assessor. Interestingly, all three of the panelists come from accredited agencies, and all three of the panelists are or have been the agency's accreditation manager. So we really have a lot of different perspectives recognized on the webinar here today. We also have from the IACLEA staff, myself, Jerry Murphy, Director of Professional Services, and Cassandra Pear, or otherwise known as Connie Pear, the Program Coordinator here at IACLEA. So the accreditation program, just a quick overview about the IACLEA accreditation program, and I'm emphasizing IACLEA because as you may know, there is a national accreditation program, and over half the states in the country administer an accreditation program for law enforcement agencies in those states. But what's unique about the IACLEA accreditation program is that it was developed by and for campus public safety professionals. So it is very much attuned to the needs of campus public safety agencies, and the standards are written specifically for campus public safety environment. The accreditation program is open to all IACLEA members, whether they are public or private institutions, large or small, sworn or non-sworn. The accreditation program, I think a good way to sort of encapsulate it is that it tells you as an agency what to do, but not necessarily how to do it. And we'll get into more detail about that a little bit later on. Finally, the accreditation program really signifies your ongoing commitment to excellence in campus public safety. And I just want to stress that ongoing commitment, because accreditation is not necessarily a moment in time. Everyone enjoys that feeling when they have completed it and they've been awarded accreditation, and they get to hang that plaque on the wall. But to be an accredited agency signifies that you're going to continue to maintain that commitment to excellence, that you're going to continue to monitor the standards and to monitor your policies and procedures and make adjustments accordingly. Agencies in the accreditation. This is our accreditation program here at IACLEA. You'll see that we have on the far left column there, we have 61 total accredited agencies. We have another 33 agencies that are candidates. That is, they have signed a contract with IACLEA and they've entered into the program and they are working towards their initial accreditation. You'll see that we have both sworn and non-sworn agencies in the program. We have a mix as well of public and private institutions, as well as 4- and 2-year institutions. And we really are putting a strong emphasis on 2-year schools and non-sworn schools joining the program. And we are making some adjustments to help facilitate their pursuit of accreditation. That, again, we'll talk about in more detail. The benefits of accreditation. We believe that there are 5 key benefits to accreditation. Accountability, both accountability and competency within your agency, and also accountability to the larger campus community. Certainly best practices is a key part of the accreditation program, and that signifies that your agency is following national best practices around operations, training, administration, and human resources. Continuous improvement is certainly a benefit. As I mentioned, it's not just a moment in time, but it really is a mindset or a management philosophy for your agency. And accreditation is also a great roadmap for agency leaders to chart a course for your agency and to continually assess what does and doesn't work. Certainly, professional and public recognition is a key part of the program. As you saw, it really is an exclusive group with just 94 agencies going through it right now. We are excited about the possibility of growing the program. And to be frank, we would love every campus public safety agency in the country to be accredited, because that signifies, again, that they are following national best practices. And finally, a 5th benefit is that accreditation really can help with risk management or risk reduction, and that the standards establish that agencies follow accepted policies and practices that minimize risk and liability and strengthen an institution or a campus's defense against complaints and lawsuits. The accreditation process, there are 5 steps in the accreditation process. The first is candidacy, and that represents those 34 agencies that are currently candidate agencies. They've entered into an agreement with IACLEA, have paid an annual fee, and then are moving forward towards their initial accreditation. That second step in that process is what those agencies are going through, the self-assessment, where the agency does an internal examination, compares its policies and procedures and practices against the standards, and then develops new policies, procedures, modifies existing policies and procedures to come into compliance with the standards. Once an agency has gone through that process, which includes a mock assessment, and again, we'll talk about the importance of a mock assessment later on, then the agency is ready for the on-site assessment, in which two assessors, these are individuals who are either active or retired campus public safety professionals who serve as consultants to IACLEA, and we contract with them to come on site and to conduct an independent, objective assessment of the agency's compliance with your standards. Those assessors will produce a report that then goes on to the commission for its review and decision, and ultimately awarding of accreditation. The fifth step in the process is, again, that maintenance and expanding of compliance. You'll see that we have a number of optional standards for which an agency has to comply with 60% of those, but an agency that achieves that initial accreditation and then moves on to the second and third should be looking to expand its compliance with those optional standards. The accreditation costs, the first year for every agency is $3,000, and then year 2 and beyond, if you have less than 10,000 students, the fee is $2,500 a year, and more than 10,000 students, the fee is $3,000 a year. The key players involved in the accreditation program are the agency chief executive, along with the agency accreditation manager. These are the two most important people in any agency, but really it requires a team effort on the part of every agency. No one person by themselves can get their agency accredited. It needs the endorsement and support of the agency chief executive. The accreditation manager is that individual who's responsible for that day-to-day management of the program, working with other supervisors, commanders, and other staff within the agency to ensure that the various components of the agency are in compliance with the standards. The Accreditation Commission, we have 12 commission members drawn from IACLEA member agencies, and these individuals set policy for the accreditation program and review and recognize agencies for their accreditation awards. I mentioned the accreditation assessors that we have, and these again are the individuals who will go out and conduct the on-site assessment. And then finally, IACLEA staff, Connie and myself, who will have a lot of contact with you from an administrative side and from a training side of things to help you get organized and answer any questions you have about the program. The standards, we have a total of 215 standards. 165 of those are core or required standards. As I mentioned, we have 50 elective standards, and an agency must comply with at least 60% of those 50. That is an additional 30 standards. We also have not applicable standards, and this is critically important to understand because some folks will read through the standards and they will say, well, we don't perform that function. So why does that standard apply to us? Well, the reality is that it won't if you do not perform a particular function. And that is a process that the staff will work with you on to make that determination, through telephone conversation or exchange of emails. And then we just have a short form and process that we ask you to go through to indicate why you believe it's not applicable. And then we will remove that standard from the 215 that you have to comply with. So again, this is critically important, especially for smaller agencies or non-sworn agencies that might not perform all of the functions of a larger sworn agency. The standard parts, there are two parts to a standard. The statement itself, which is a declarative statement identifying what must be done. And this is what you as an agency have to comply with. There's also a commentary for most of the standards, and that's really an explanation of the standard's intent. It might even give examples, but the commentary itself is non-binding. Again, it's the standard that you must comply with. So folks ask, well, what do these standards require us to do? Really, when you take the 215, you can really boil it down to 6 different categories of standards. Standards will require you as an agency to establish policies, also to develop procedures that are more specific, maintain facilities and equipment, conduct training and exercises for your staff and for the agency, to compile reports, and these are reports that are really management reports that are of value to your agency, but as an accrediting body, we want to make sure that, in fact, you are compiling these reports and following them and adhering to any findings or recommendations you as an agency develop from the data you collect. And then finally, the standards require agencies to perform inspections. Some of these might be on a quarterly basis or an annual basis, conduct or perform assessments. This might be, if you will, sort of a crime prevention assessment, and to conduct or perform surveys over the course of, again, these inspections and assessments and surveys are usually something that is done connected to a specific time period. Again, it might be quarterly, semi-annually, annually. Some of them are even further out, every other year or every 4 years. Let's talk a little bit about agency policies and procedures, because this is a key part of the accreditation program. Really, for an agency to succeed at accreditation, they do need to have comprehensive policies and procedures that correspond to the standards. A policy, it specifies an agency's approach to a particular issue or challenge and outlines requirements for agency staff. And oftentimes these are guided by safety, legal, ethical, or regulatory demands. You know, we can all think of the significant policies, whether that be use of force or pursuit or Title IX investigations. But policies also cover a variety of other issues. But the policy is really the agency's statement about how it's going to approach that particular issue or challenge. And by developing policy, agency staff will have clear expectations for their performance. The procedures are those set of steps to follow to implement a policy. And these describe for agency staff, what to do and in what order and really how to do it. So if an agency is coming into an accreditation program with a really good comprehensive policy and procedure manual, that's a great beginning to achieve accreditation. If you feel like your policy and procedures need additional work, then that's something you might want to focus on before making that commitment to the accreditation program. But the reality is probably every agency will have to do some tweaking of their policies and procedures. Perhaps new ones have to be developed, or existing ones have to be modified to come into compliance with the standards. The standard files are, again, a key part of this program. And so what are the contents of those files? And this is the way that an agency demonstrates compliance with the standards. So within, let's just assume for sake of discussion that you have 200 standards that you have to comply with. Then you'll need 200 files, file folders, whether these are paper or electronic. And within those files, you will have the standard, which is telling you as an agency what to do. You will then include in there your written directive, which in many cases is going to be policy or procedure. of the agency, but it might be a campus policy or a procedure. It might even be state law. That could be a written directive. But in that file, you will put the written directive, which describes how you as an agency do a particular procedure to comply with the standard. And then the final part of the folder are the proofs of compliance. And this demonstrates the agency's adherence to its own policies and also to the accreditation standards. Proofs of compliance, there are three different types of proofs of compliance. One is written documentation. Again, that's going to be everything from a agency policy or procedure. It could include a report. It might be a map. It might be an organizational chart. It might be a curriculum for training. It could be a roster of individuals who have gone to training. But basically something in writing that the agency produces and adheres to. Observation is another type of proof of compliance, and that is the assessors being able to lay eyes on something, to visually see perhaps your communications center, perhaps the evidence room, different equipment, or other facilities, other rooms rather, in your facilities. And then finally, the third type is interviews. And this would be the assessors conducting interviews with agency personnel who are knowledgeable about the agency's adherence to the standards. So what we'd like to do now is open it up to questions and discussion. Perhaps some of you have used the chat function to pose questions. And so let me turn it over to Neil at this point to see if any questions have come in.
Thanks, Jerry. We do have a couple of questions. We have Sandy, excuse me for mispronunciation of your last name, Schnorrenberg. She says, we are currently a candidate for accreditation. We are a non-sworn security department, and I find that quite a few of the standards would not be applicable to us in how we do business and or are authorized to do business. Is there a list of those standards that you don't hold non-sworn departments accountable for? I want to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Could I ask Jim or Jessica to reply to that?
So this is Jim. That's something we were speaking about at the Accreditation Commission, was coming up with a standard checklist. Being non-sworn, it's kind of, you look at it and you're like, oh wow, half of these don't apply. But as of right now, there isn't a standard checklist for it. It just doesn't apply because I'm non-sworn. For example, I said, oh, use of force doesn't apply to me because we don't carry weapons. Long story short, I have a pretty intensive use of force policy because if you put your hands on somebody, you probably should have a policy.
Jessica, could you add anything from your perspective?
Yeah, can you hear me? I just would like to say too that Jerry mentioned earlier about the conversation between headquarters and either the accreditation CEO, or I'm sorry, the department CEO or the accreditation manager. Part of the problem with a list is that every department is different, as we all know. And so when we try and list things, it becomes, that can be problematic as well. So I'd really encourage you to have the conversation with Jerry or with Connie to talk about those standards specifically, and then you can decide what either applies or does not apply.
Good, thank you. And Sandy, I have your contact information, and I will reach out to you, after the webinar, and we can sort of begin that conversation about helping you identify which standards might be not applicable. Tamara, I wonder if I could ask you if you've had any experience in either as an accreditation manager or in conducting assessments of agencies that have had standards that have been determined to be non-applicable, and what is that process like as an assessor?
Yeah, so have come across that situation. Again, like what Jessica said, it's going to depend on the agency. So if you are an agency and you're going through your self-assessment, you may run across a standard that you say, this simply does not apply to my agency. You will fill out a not applicable by function form and state your reasoning why you feel it does not apply to your agency. Submit that form to Jerry. He will review that, sign off on it, and then when us assessors come to your agency, we will verify that that is the case. It does not apply. So we're going to look at the standard itself. We're going to look at what you have in place. Sometimes it may be a certain law that may prevent you from doing something, or jurisdictional boundaries, depending on the parent agencies you may have to report to by being non-sworn. But we're going to look at all that and verify that it indeed does not apply. And then once we're done with that verification, then we will determine that it actually does not apply to your agency, and we will mark it as such. So that would be exempted from your 215 standards.
Yeah, and again, just to emphasize, really the best place to begin that process is a conversation with Connie or me. We're working with a number of agencies that are going through that process right now. So oftentimes, they will send me an email or pick up the phone and talk it through, and then we'll just have you do that, what we call that NA form, not applicable form. It doesn't require much. So we're trying not to bog you down in paperwork, but that's the best way to go through and determine exactly which standards apply to your agency. Neil, are there other questions?
Oh yeah, there are a good amount of questions coming in, and to all of our attendees, please keep asking questions. The point of this is to ask questions, get all questions answered. So keep them coming, guys. The next question is, what is the difference between a standard that is non-applicable as opposed to a standard that is waived?
That's a great question. Tamara, have you had any experience with waived standards?
We had one particular one, and it was based on the way the agency's jurisdictional laws were written. So I can't remember off the top of my head which standard in particular was, but it had to do with something. I think it was the information that they provide to juvenile detainees or something along those lines. So with that one, we had to do a great deal of interviewing and, verifying, of course, while we were there. And we ultimately had to submit that on to IACLEA. So Jerry and Connie would review that information. But there are a few to where some agencies, depending on your agency makeup, where you could get a waiver, which will exempt you from that standard. But it does bear semblance to being not applicable by function, though, in some cases. But this is particularly, you may see this with time-sensitive standards, where you may need a waiver if you need more time to comply with that. Let's just say you're in your assessment period, and it requires you to submit documentation twice a year. You notice that you've had proof that you did it one time that year, but then for some reason or another, you failed to do it the second time that year. You may need to apply for a waiver, which is essentially an extension of time.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And the waiver of standards is really something that is done sort of in extraordinary circumstances. A waiver is essentially a standard that the agency has to comply with, but for some extenuating circumstances, is unable to comply with. So as Tamara indicated, you know, the best way to try to deal with this up front is to do a non-applicable. And if we can determine that the standard's not applicable, then that's the way we want to go, because that is, it's an easier, it's a cleaner process. The waiver usually occurs while the assessors, you know, are on site. And again, this is a standard the agency is supposed to comply with, but something unusual has happened by which it can't. So then at that point, it might even go on to the commission for the commission to deliberate on whether or not they will grant the waiver and ultimately accreditation. So trying to handle it as early as possible on the front end with a non-applicable status, if that is appropriate, is the way to go.
I'll just add this real quick, Jerry. You may also see your waivers come in if it's an equipment purchase that has to be made, but you're still waiting on a purchase order or something of that nature as well.
Yeah, good example. Thank you.
Okay, the next question is, how many years is the self-assessment?
Good question. We, you know, it's going to vary by agency. We do sort of establish a 3-year time period from when the agency signs a contract, enters it into an agreement with IACLEA, that they will have their on-site assessment within 3 years. Now, not every agency requires all 3 years, and what I'd like to do is ask, you know, both Jim and Jessica to talk a little bit about their agency's experiences and how long it took them to go through that self-assessment process.
I'll let Jessica go first.
Okay, thank you. So here at MCW, it took us about 18 months from the time of signature to our on-site. And I would say that's probably on the short end. We were motivated by a couple of different things that we had going on institutionally, but it was a heavy lift. So just really taking the time to determine where you are prior to candidacy, and then making sure that it's a team, it's a joint effort to get through that self-assessment period to make sure that you're ready to go for your mock and then for your on-site. Yeah, so for us, like I said, about 18 months.
Mine was a little unique because I wasn't sure we could do it, you know, being a smaller agency, non-sworn. So before we even applied, I took what I called my spring road trip from Smitty down in Anne Arundel all the way up to New Hampshire, visiting a bunch of agencies. Once I did that and convinced the boss we could do it, it was probably almost 2 years after we applied that we actually had our mock accreditation.
Yeah, another key part of this is that you know, we set that sort of 3-year time period, you know, for the agency to achieve accreditation. Now, the agency can continue working if it goes beyond the 3 years. You know, for instance, we've had agencies where they have had just, I won't name the agency, but they had a significant active shooter event that sort of took precedence, if you will, and you know, the after the investigation and the debriefing and the after action, et cetera. So that took precedence, and the agency had to you know, put accreditation on hold for a year and a half or so, but then came back to it. So in that case, they took longer than 3 years. We have, you know, technically where we will, you know, potentially have the agency, if they don't meet it within 3 years, pay an additional fee a late fee, but we do that on a case-by-case basis, so that if there are extenuating circumstances, we would certainly want to take that into consideration. What we don't talk about specifically is how little time do you need to conduct the self-assessment. For instance, if an agency applied for accreditation and then came to us 2 months later and said, well, we're ready for our on-site now. The reality is that's going to create some additional challenges or problems for the agency because they really haven't been in the program long enough to demonstrate compliance with what we call the time-sensitive standards. So these are things, it's one thing to develop a sort of a static policy that you can put in place right away and then everyone starts following it. The time-sensitive standards, again, usually require you to do something over a period of time, quarterly, semi-annually, annually. So while the assessors can keep that in mind while they're on site, let's say there's a standard that requires you to do something every other year, every 2 years. And so perhaps you've only done that once by the time the assessors arrive on site. Well, that's something that they can take into consideration, the fact that you've done it once and you're working towards doing it again. But if you haven't complied with any of those time-sensitive standards yet, you are going to bump up against problems, demonstrating. Again, you can have it in writing, but we also want that written documentation that demonstrates that the agency is actually doing what it says it's going to be doing. So to do it in less than a year is pretty unusual. So somewhere between that year and 3-year mark is pretty typical for the agencies. Neil?
All right, Jay, thank you so much. The next question is, does IACLEA utilize Power DMS to house the accreditation?
So some of you may know this, some of you may not. Their organization called Power DMS that has available a number of modules that agencies can use for developing and tracking their policies and procedures, developing and tracking training programs. Also, they have a module for the accreditation program, which helps an agency build out its proofs of compliance in electronic form. There are a number of organizations out there. Power DMS is one, PMAM is another. We do not require agencies to use any of those electronic systems. A number of our agencies in the program do use Power DMS. A number of agencies, relatively new agencies to the program, are using PMAM. And some agencies still rely on paper files. So we are agnostic, that is, we don't promote or refer any of those organizations that provide those electronic filing systems. So agencies can use whichever one they require, or they can stick with paper files. For those agencies that do use the electronic files, I will say that it makes the assessment process run a little bit smoother. But let me stop there and ask Tamara if she could talk about her experience with any of the electronic systems, both as an accreditation manager and what that means for an assessor when they arrive or even before they arrive on site.
Okay, so if you are using an electronic system for your assessment, it does make it easier because we have earlier access to your files versus waiting on you to mail the paper copy of the files, because you would have to mail a percentage to us before we arrived on site. So we can get through all the chapters before we initially left when we arrive at the agency. So it does make it easier in that aspect, being able to look at your files while offsite. And then the other thing is, you doing it electronically, you have the ability to see when the assessor has made notes on a particular file, so you know what to correct right away as we move through that. So you can see that. So that's another benefit that we've noticed if it's electronic. You will get the same notes if you do use paper files. It's just you're going to have to wait on us to finish the chapter, and then you'll get one big email versus seeing it each individual file as we're moving through it. So it does save some time having it electronic, but either way, I've done several, whether it's electronic or paper, and they've all been successful.
Yeah, Tamara brings up a good point that even if you are relying on paper files, we do ask you about a month out, 3 weeks out at the most to send, whether they be hard copies, or you scan the files and put them on a thumb drive and send those out. But to send those to the assessors before they arrive on site, because that gives them an opportunity to get a sense of how the agency is doing in its compliance. It helps to reduce their workload while they are on site, so they can spend more time talking to agency staff or observing agency facilities or operations. And it also lets them, identify any standards that might need additional work. So they might take a look at a particular standard in the agency documentation and say, we really would like to see an additional proof of compliance, or, your policy as it's written doesn't exactly correspond to the standard, and so you're going to need to change this. So, while the assessors are on site, there often can be a lot of, time spent in Word or some other, word processing system, changing policies and getting those adjusted. So that process can sometimes begin before the assessors even get on site. Jim or Jessica, do either of you have experience with ParaDMS or PMAM?
So I was doing my mock assessment, and the two assessors came up. I had 6 binders, and they looked at me and said, "Jim, we can do this, but we probably be here about 3 days." And we talked about ParaDMS. That just happened to be the one they used at their facilities. Called a buddy of mine who was the program manager at another institution. He said, "You're crazy to try and do this without an electronic system. It's just too much paperwork." Later that night, I had an electronic system, and I was up and loaded before the assessors even left my facility. So I'm an advocate for the electronic versions, no matter which one you use.
And this is Jessica, and I'll just say that we did our first 2 site assessments with paper files, and we have now converted to PowerDMS, and are finding it, especially for the time-sensitive standards, to be a great tool to keeping us on track, because it really, like Jerry said in the intro, the accreditation is also about the ongoing piece of it. It's truly our commitment to best practices. And that's not just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing everyday thing. So that's probably the biggest benefit, just besides paper reduction, but that we've seen.
Great, thank you. Any other questions,
All right.
Neil?
Yeah, we have some more questions. The next question is, does the institution have to pay travel expenses for the assessors? Sorry.
The answer is no. So that is part of the agency's annual fee that they pay to be in the program. That covers the costs of the assessors traveling on site, and it covers the cost of the staff time to administer the program. But that annual fee is the only fee that you need to pay.
Jerry, if I could just ask a quick question, does that include the mock assessors as well?
No, Jim, it doesn't. And so the mock assessment is really the agency's responsibility. And so we will help potentially identify individuals who could do the mock assessment, but we don't necessarily get involved, IACLEA, in running that mock assessment. Now, the mock assessment, many agencies around the country are part of what's called a police accreditation coalition. And as I mentioned, more than half of the states in the country have law enforcement accreditation programs. There's a national program, IACLEA, you may have heard of, Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. And between the states and the national and IACLEA, many states have established, or regions have established, a PAC. And so if you are actively pursuing accreditation as an agency, and say you're the accreditation manager, I would urge you to reach out to the PAC closest to you. If you can't figure out which ones those are, contact Connie or me, and we can help you do that. I had an email this morning from someone that was asking that very question. So we were able to connect her to a regional PAC. And that PAC is really, it's a loose affiliation, if you will, of accreditation managers and assessors. And so you will probably find once you join that there are, if they are not campus public safety, it could be city, could be county, could be state law enforcement agencies that are accredited or in the accreditation process. And that mock assessment is when you rely on your colleagues in neighboring departments to come in and go through your files before the assessors. If you're doing this for 3 years as an accreditation manager, you end up perhaps overlooking something that you didn't mean to. So by bringing in some outside eyes and having them go through your files, they will be able to identify areas that you need to make some improvements or enhancements to. So the mock assessment, oftentimes that it's someone who's close enough they can get in a car and drive an hour or two and come to your agency. Our assessors we're national, so we oftentimes have to fly our assessors to your agency. But again, those are costs that are part of your annual fee. Good. Neil?
The next question is, how does IACLEA accreditation differ from CALEA accreditation?
I'm going to ask one of my panelists. Who wants to volunteer for that?
I'll take a stab. Here we go. This is Tamara. Well, the main difference that I have seen is that IACLEA is campus law enforcement specific. So if you are looking for the best practices as it pertains to campus law enforcement agencies, then IACLEA specializes in that. CALEA, on the other hand, it's law enforcement specific, so you're lumping in not just campus law enforcement, but also your other municipalities, so your city, state, and county agencies as well.
And this is Jessica, and I would just add too that while obviously the campus law enforcement piece of it is critical, it's also for the non-sworns. It's also for the campus public safety agencies. My agency specifically, we're non-sworn. CALEA, when we first became accredited, CALEA was not an option for us because we're not a law enforcement agency. IACLEA really is the best practices for campus public safety agencies.
Jim, anything to add?
just that big part that you mentioned, that the non-sworn agencies can get in the game now. And it's pretty cool when you can sit there and say that to parents that my agency has the same accreditation standards as that sworn police department that just drove by and more, because we have stuff specific for the college.
We also, the chart we presented earlier showing the agencies in our program, we also have a component of our program for agencies that do have IACLEA accreditation. They can also achieve what we call joint accreditation. So again, these are agencies, to be candid with you, most of them are large public universities, often flagship universities for a particular state, that are fully sworn and armed law enforcement agencies. They receive accreditation through IACLEA, but then they also are able to receive IACLEA accreditation by complying with additional standards. We have an additional up to 18 standards that an agency has to demonstrate compliance with to achieve what we call IACLEA joint. So even those agencies, probably the biggest campus police departments in the country that have IACLEA accreditation, there are still areas of operations and policies and programs that are not covered by IACLEA. And so those are those additional 18 standards that we have that we require them to demonstrate. Again, these are very campus-specific standards that they are complying with those.
Thank you, guys. The next question is, if a university operates a campus in multi-states, too, would we be considered one or more than one for cost purposes? Would assessors have to visit both campuses during an assessment?
I'm sorry, Neil, I missed the very beginning of that. Could you repeat that?
Sure, no problem. The question is, if a university operates a campus in multi-states or two, would we be considered one or more than one for cost purposes? The second part of the question is, would assessors have to visit both campuses during an assessment?
So I think that's something that we would take on a case-by-case basis in terms of having a discussion with the campus agency to determine exactly how they are organized and their authority across the different campuses. So we have a number of agencies in the program right now that do have responsibility for several different campuses. There's usually, I think in every one of these, there's a predominant, a major campus, if you will, and then a smaller or satellite campus. So those are programs, those are agencies rather that are in the accreditation program. And whether or not each campus has to be visited, that would be a discussion that we would have with that particular agency as we come up on the assessment. It's going to determine, part of what will determine that is what facilities and resources are at the different campuses. Again, if it's a primary campus, oftentimes evidence room, communication center will be at that primary campus. So, and that's a benefit again of being able to see and review the standards before the assessors arrive on site. Because if they can get through the paperwork part of the assessment, then that does give them more opportunity to spend time observing and interviewing folks and visiting other campuses as well. So again, it's really sort of a case-by-case basis, but I would not discourage you if you have more than one campus from contacting us, and we can discuss your situation.
Thanks, Jerry. The next question is, how well does LEMAP review prepare you for your self-assessment?
Okay, so IACLEA runs a program. It was called LEMAP for many years. We've changed the name. It is now called PREP for Peer Review Program. And this is an assessment we will send. It's separate and apart from accreditation. And we will send 3 individuals, again, active or retired campus public safety. I think just about all of them are chiefs or have been chiefs. And they will come on site and spend 3 days on your agency conducting, if you will, a management and operations review of your campus public safety agency. That review is based on the accreditation standards. So we have 18 chapters of accreditation standards, and when those assessors are when the prep team is on site, they will review your policies, your operations, your administration by using, in many cases, the accreditation standards as a guide, or they will take the standard and turn it into a question and ask the agency, are you doing this? What comes out of that assessment is a very comprehensive report, that could be anywhere from 50 to 75 pages with a lot of recommendations. And many agencies have found that LEMAP, or the PREP as we call it now, a terrific roadmap towards getting to accreditation, because it identifies for them very specifically the gaps that the agency has between the standards and their current policies or practices. So by using the standards as a framework, it will provide specific recommendations around where an agency needs to develop policies, procedures, implement programs, expand training, perhaps make facility improvements. So it is a great tool that agencies can use towards accreditation. I know I can't say everyone. We've done over 175. IACLEA has done more than 175 of the combined LEMAPs and PREPs, and it is highly, highly unusual that we will do one of an accredited agency. We often do it of agencies that are thinking about accreditation. I can tell you that in virtually every LEMAP and PREP, the recommendation is for the agency to pursue accreditation. And to help the agency do that, we provide them with that written report with very specific recommendations.
Jerry, if I may, having participated in one of those as the evaluator, for lack of better terms, in conversation with the school, that was one thing they said. They said, we have the accreditation laid out in front of us now. We know what we have to fix, and this is a no-brainer for us to actually go through with the accreditation. That's how detailed the review was. It was almost a mock accreditation.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jim. Neil, I'm not sure how we're doing on time. We might be bumping up against 3 o'clock here.
Yeah, we're pushing 3:01, so I think this is a good place to stop. We do have a few more questions, and I'm taking them down so we can get these questions answered. I'd like to thank you I'd like to send a thank you to the accreditation. Sorry about that. I'm sorry. I'd like to thank you, thank the Accreditation Commission for being with us today, and thank all of you for participating. We hope you found this webinar informative. If you have any questions that you think of later, please reach out to Jerry and or Connie, and let them know. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on Connections along with the PowerPoint later on today. IACLEA will continue to do webinars and other trainings on current topics, so check IACLEA.org or website calendar, IACLEA Connections, and social media regularly for updates. Additionally, registration for IACLEA's 2020 Executive Development Institute is currently open, and register by January 27th to receive a significant discount. For more information on today's webinar presentation, please contact Jerry Murphy at jmurphy@iaclea.org or Connie Pear, that's CPAIR, @iaclea.org for more questions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day and stay safe.